The morning mist still clung to Boston Harbor when Captain William Prescott received word that would change the course of American history. It was April 19th, 1775, and the echo of musket fire from Lexington and Concord had barely faded when Colonial messengers began spreading the alarm throughout Massachusetts. The British had fired upon Colonial militia, and blood had been spilled on American soil. Prescott stood atop Breed's Hill, his weathered hands gripping the rail of his farmhouse porch as he watched smoke rise from the direction of Concord. The British expedition, led by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, had marched out of Boston the previous night with orders to destroy Colonial military supplies. What they found instead was a countryside in arms, ready to defend their liberty with their lives. The news traveled faster than the retreating British column. Paul Revere's midnight ride had awakened the sleeping giant of colonial resistance, and now that giant was stirring with terrible purpose. From every village and hamlet, militiamen grabbed their muskets and powder horns, kissed their wives goodbye, and set out for Boston. They came not as an organized army, but as free men united by a common cause. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor of Massachusetts, found himself in an increasingly precarious position within Boston. His forces, once the masters of the colonial capital, were now effectively trapped on a peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land called Boston Neck. The very geography that had made Boston an ideal port for British control now worked against them. As reported in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study Paul Revere's Ride, the colonial response was both spontaneous and coordinated, demonstrating a level of organization that surprised British commanders. Militia companies from throughout New England began converging on Boston, their numbers swelling with each passing hour. Dr. Joseph Warren, a prominent Boston physician and patriot leader, worked tirelessly to coordinate the colonial response. From his position in the countryside, he sent messages to militia commanders throughout the region, urging them to surround Boston and prevent any British reinforcement or escape. Warren understood that the moment called for bold action, not cautious deliberation. The British troops, who had marched so confidently to Concord, now found themselves running a gauntlet of colonial fire as they retreated toward Boston. Every stone wall, every barn, every patch of wood seemed to conceal colonial marksmen. The disciplined ranks that had easily dispersed the militia at Lexington were now being picked apart by an enemy who refused to fight by European rules. Captain John Parker, whose Lexington militia had faced the British advance that morning, gathered his scattered men and joined the growing crowd of colonials shadowing the British retreat. His orders to his men that morning had become prophetic. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. The war had indeed begun, and now it was following the British all the way back to Boston. By afternoon, the British column had reached the safety of Boston, but their troubles were only beginning. Colonial militia units were already taking positions on the hills surrounding the city, and more were arriving every hour. What had begun as a simple expedition to destroy military supplies had evolved into something far more dangerous for British control of Massachusetts. The siege of Boston was about to begin, and neither side fully understood the magnitude of what they had set in motion. The British were trapped, the colonials were angry, and the die of revolution had been cast. The sun set on April 19th, 1775, casting long shadows across the hills surrounding Boston as Colonial militiamen continued to pour in from across New England. What had started as scattered resistance to a British foraging expedition was rapidly transforming into something unprecedented in colonial history. A coordinated siege of the most important British stronghold in North America. General Artemas Ward, the senior Massachusetts militia officer, established his headquarters in Cambridge and began the daunting task of organizing the thousands of volunteers streaming into the area. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who had left their plows and shops to defend their liberty. Many had never been more than 20 miles from their homes, yet here they were, preparing to challenge the might of the British Empire. The British found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. General Gage, from his headquarters in Boston, could see colonial campfires dotting the surrounding hills like angry stars. The city that had once been a symbol of British authority was becoming a prison. Its walls formed not of stone, but of armed men determined to prevent any British movement. Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill, Dorchester Heights, and the hills of Roxbury all began to bristle with colonial positions. The militiamen, many of whom had served in the French and Indian War, understood the value of controlling the high ground. They began constructing earthworks and fortifications, using techniques learned in previous conflicts against the French and their Native American allies. The logistics of maintaining a siege presented enormous challenges for the Colonials. Unlike the British, who could rely on supplies from their fleet in Boston Harbor, the militia had to organize their own supply lines from scratch. Committees of correspondence, which had been formed to coordinate resistance to British policies, now found themselves managing the complex task of feeding and arming an army. Colonel William Prescott of Pepperell emerged as one of the key figures in organizing the siege. A veteran of the French and Indian War, Prescott understood that enthusiasm alone would not sustain a long siege. The militia needed discipline, organization, and a clear chain of command. He worked tirelessly to transform the enthusiastic but chaotic gathering of volunteers into something resembling a military force. The British, meanwhile, were not idle. General Gage recognized the gravity of his situation and began planning countermeasures. His forces controlled Boston and the harbor, but they were effectively cut off from the countryside that had provided food and supplies. The Royal Navy could bring provisions from other colonies or from Britain itself, but this would be expensive and time-consuming. Captain John Montreser, the chief British engineer, surveyed the colonial positions and reported to Gage that the rebels were constructing fortifications with surprising skill. According to historical accounts preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, British officers were beginning to realize that they faced a more formidable opponent than they had initially anticipated. The psychological impact of the siege was perhaps as important as its military significance. For the first time since the beginning of the colonial crisis, British authority was being openly and effectively challenged by force of arms. The Colonials had not merely protested or petitioned. They had taken up weapons and used them successfully against regular British troops. News of the siege spread rapidly throughout the colonies. Express riders carried dispatches south to New York, Philadelphia, and beyond, informing other colonial leaders of the dramatic events in Massachusetts. The response was immediate and supportive, with offers of men, money, and supplies pouring in from sister colonies. As the first week of the siege wore on, both sides began to understand that they were engaged in something far more significant than a local disturbance. The British Empire was being challenged in its very heartland, and the Colonials were demonstrating a unity and determination that surprised even their own leaders. By mid-May of 1775, the siege of Boston had settled into a tense standoff that would test the resolve of both sides. The colonial forces, now numbering over 15,000 men, had effectively sealed off Boston from the Massachusetts countryside, but they lacked the artillery and naval power necessary to assault the city directly. The British, secure behind their fortifications and supported by the Royal Navy, found themselves masters of Boston but prisoners within it. The arrival of reinforcements from Britain, under Generals William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, in late May dramatically changed the dynamics of the siege. These three experienced officers, who would later play crucial roles in the wider American Revolution, brought with them fresh troops and new strategies for breaking the colonial stranglehold on Boston. General Gage, now reinforced and under pressure from London to restore British authority, began planning offensive operations against the colonial positions. The British High Command had initially dismissed the colonial militia as little more than an armed mob, but weeks of siege had demonstrated that these farmers with muskets possessed both determination and military competence that demanded respect. The colonial response to British reinforcement was swift and decisive. The Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, appointed George Washington of Virginia as commander-in-chief of what would become the Continental Army. Washington's appointment was both practical and symbolic, bringing a Southern leader to command what had been primarily a New England effort in demonstrating colonial unity. In the face of British power, Washington received word of his appointment while still in Philadelphia and immediately began planning his journey to Massachusetts. He understood that the siege of Boston would be his first test as commander-in-chief, and that success or failure there would likely determine the fate of the entire colonial cause. The militiamen surrounding Boston, meanwhile, were growing restless. Many had left their farms and businesses expecting a short campaign, but the siege was stretching into its second month with no clear resolution in sight. Discipline problems began to emerge as men accustomed to civilian life chafed under military routine and the boredom of siege warfare. Dr. Joseph Warren, now serving as president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, worked tirelessly to maintain morale and coordinate supplies for the besieging forces. Warren understood that the siege was as much a test of political will as military might, and he used his considerable influence to keep the colonial cause united and focused. The British, recognizing the strategic importance of controlling the high ground around Boston, began planning an assault on the colonial positions. General Howe, fresh from Britain and eager to demonstrate British superiority, advocated for aggressive action to break the siege. His plan called for a direct assault on the colonial fortifications, relying on British discipline and superior training to overcome colonial numerical advantages. Intelligence reports reaching both sides indicated that the other was preparing for major action. Colonial spies in Boston reported British preparations for offensive operations, while British reconnaissance missions observed increased activity in the colonial camps. The stage was being set for the first major battle of what would become the American Revolution, as documented in contemporary accounts from the Boston Public Library's Revolutionary War collection. The tension in and around Boston during this period was palpable. Citizens trapped in the city faced shortages of food and fuel, while the surrounding countryside bristled with armed men preparing for battle. The siege of Boston was evolving from a spontaneous response to British aggression into a formal military campaign that would determine whether the colonial rebellion could sustain itself against professional European forces. Both sides understood that the outcome would have implications far beyond Massachusetts, potentially determining the future relationship between Britain and all of its American colonies. The morning of June 17, 1775, dawned clear and hot as colonial forces moved under cover of darkness to fortify Breed's Hill, closer to Boston than the originally planned Bunker Hill. Colonel William Prescott led approximately 1,000 men in this bold maneuver, constructing earthworks within easy cannon range of the British fleet in Boston Harbor. The British awoke to find colonial fortifications where none had existed the day before. General Gage and his senior officers, including Generals Howe, Clinton, and Burgoyne, gathered to observe the colonial position through telescopes from Boston. The sight of enemy earthworks overlooking their positions was both insulting and strategically threatening, demanding immediate action. Admiral Samuel Graves ordered his warships to bombard the colonial position, and the thunder of naval cannon echoed across Boston Harbor as British ships poured fire into the hastily constructed redoubt. The Lively, Falcon, and other vessels maintained a steady bombardment, but the colonial earthworks, though crude, proved surprisingly effective at protecting the defenders. General Howe, given command of the assault, planned a frontal attack that would demonstrate British superiority through disciplined advance and superior firepower. He believed that colonial militia, faced with the sight of British regulars advancing in perfect formation, would break and run as they had at Lexington. This assessment would prove tragically mistaken. The British force numbered approximately 2,200 men, including some of the finest regiments in the service. The light infantry, grenadiers, and line companies that formed up on Charlestown Peninsula represented the cream of British military might, veterans of European campaigns and colonial warfare. As the British began their advance up Breed's Hill, Colonel Prescott walked the line of his makeshift fortifications, encouraging his men with words that would become legendary. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." This was not merely bravado, but sound tactical advice, as the colonial forces had limited ammunition and needed to make every shot count. The first British assault began with parade ground precision, red-coated ranks advancing steadily up the slope despite the withering fire from colonial positions. The sight was magnificent and terrible, as professional soldiers maintained their formation even as men fell around them. But the disciplined advance that had won victories across the globe was meeting something new in America: accurate rifle fire from determined defenders fighting for their homes. Dr. Joseph Warren, who had left his medical practice and political duties to fight as a private soldier, was among the defenders in the redoubt. His presence symbolized the commitment of colonial leadership to the cause they were asking others to support with their lives. Warren, despite his prominent position in Massachusetts politics, served in the ranks like any other volunteer. The first British assault faltered and fell back as colonial fire tore through the advancing ranks. Officers fell alongside their men, and the famous British discipline began to waver under the accurate fire of colonial marksmen. General Howe himself was struck by the effectiveness of the colonial defense, noting later that he had never experienced such devastating fire from irregular forces. Undaunted by the initial repulse, Howe reformed his troops for a second assault. British officers, recognizing that their initial tactics had proven inadequate, modified their approach while maintaining the basic strategy of frontal assault. The second advance met the same fate as the first, with colonial fire again proving devastatingly effective against exposed British formations. As referenced in eyewitness accounts preserved in the archives of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the carnage during these assaults was unprecedented in colonial warfare. British casualties mounted alarmingly, with entire companies losing half their strength in minutes of fighting. The third British assault finally carried the position, but only after the colonial defenders had exhausted their ammunition and were forced to withdraw. Even in retreat, the militia maintained enough organization to prevent the victory from becoming a rout, withdrawing to fight another day rather than dissolving in panic. The Battle of Bunker Hill was technically a British victory as they held the field at day's end, but the cost was staggering. British casualties exceeded 1,000 men, including many officers, while colonial losses were less than half that number. The battle demonstrated that American colonials could stand against professional European troops and inflict devastating casualties in the process. The dust had barely settled from the Battle of Bunker Hill when George Washington arrived in Cambridge on July 2, 1775, to assume command of what the Continental Congress had designated the Continental Army. The tall Virginian, resplendent in his blue and buff uniform, brought with him not only military experience from the French and Indian War, but also the symbolic weight of Southern support. For what had begun as a New England rebellion, Washington's first survey of the forces surrounding Boston revealed both promise and significant challenges. The colonial army numbered approximately 17,000 men, but this impressive figure masked serious deficiencies in organization, supply, and discipline. Many units were barely distinguishable from armed mobs, with officers elected by their men and military protocol largely ignored in favor of democratic discussion. The new commander-in-chief moved quickly to impose military discipline on forces. Accustomed to the informal ways of militia service, Washington understood that while enthusiasm and determination were valuable assets, they would not be sufficient to sustain a long campaign against professional British forces. Regular drill, standardized procedures, and clear chains of command would be essential for transforming volunteers into soldiers. The challenge of supply proved even more daunting than issues of discipline. The Continental Army lacked adequate gunpowder, artillery, and even basic necessities like blankets and shoes. Washington's correspondence from this period, preserved in the Library of Congress, reveals his constant struggle to maintain an army that existed largely on promises and patriotic fervor rather than reliable logistical support. British General Gage, meanwhile, was dealing with his own challenges within Boston. The city's civilian population, caught between opposing armies, faced severe shortages of food and fuel. Many prominent loyalists who had initially welcomed British protection now questioned whether the Crown could actually maintain control of Massachusetts against such determined resistance. The replacement of General Gage by General Howe in October 1775 marked a shift in British strategy from defensive containment to active operations against the colonial forces. Howe, still smarting from the casualties suffered at Bunker Hill, was determined to demonstrate British military superiority through decisive action against Washington's army. Washington's greatest innovation during the early months of his command was the integration of forces from different colonies into a truly continental army. Soldiers from Massachusetts served alongside men from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, gradually developing a shared identity that transcended colonial boundaries. This process was neither smooth nor automatic, as regional prejudices and competing loyalties initially created significant friction. The artillery crisis that plagued Washington's army throughout the autumn of 1775 seemed almost insurmountable. The colonials possessed few cannon and lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture more, while the British positions in Boston were protected by some of the finest artillery in the world. This disparity in firepower made any direct assault on the city virtually impossible. Henry Knox, a young bookseller from Boston who had studied military engineering in his spare time, proposed a solution that seemed almost fantastical in its audacity. Knox volunteered to travel to Fort Ticonderoga in New York, where Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had captured a substantial British artillery train earlier in the year and transport the cannon to Boston over 300 miles of wilderness. In the dead of winter. Washington, recognizing both the desperate need for artillery and Knox's determination, approved the mission in November 1775. Knox's expedition, traveling by ox-drawn sleds through the frozen landscapes of New York and Massachusetts, would prove to be one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the entire war. The morale of the Continental Army during this period fluctuated wildly based on news from other fronts and the success of recruitment efforts. Many enlistments were due to expire at the end of 1775, and Washington faced the possibility of watching his army simply dissolve. As men returned to their homes and civilian occupations, the psychological warfare between the opposing forces intensified as the siege dragged on. British propaganda emphasized the futility of colonial resistance against the world's most powerful empire, while American pamphlets and newspapers stressed the justice of their cause and the possibility of victory against tyranny. As 1775 drew to a close, both armies prepared for what would likely be decisive action in the spring. Washington used the winter months to drill his troops, improve fortifications, and await Knox's return with the desperately needed artillery. The siege of Boston was entering its final phase, and both sides understood that the outcome would determine whether the American rebellion could sustain itself against British power. The impossible had become reality on a frozen January morning in 1776, when Henry Knox's expedition arrived in Cambridge with 59 pieces of artillery, captured from Fort Ticonderoga. The 25-year-old bookseller had accomplished what military experts had deemed impossible, transporting cannons weighing thousands of pounds across 300 miles of wilderness roads. In the depths of winter. Washington immediately grasped the strategic implications of Knox's achievement. For the first time since the siege began, the Continental Army possessed the firepower necessary to threaten British positions in Boston. Effectively, the general began planning an operation that would capitalize on this new capability while maintaining the element of surprise essential to success. The key to Washington's plan was Dorchester Heights, a commanding position south of Boston that both armies had largely ignored throughout the siege. British military engineers had recognized the strategic importance of these heights, but had never adequately fortified them, assuming that any colonial attempt to occupy the position could be easily detected and repulsed. Washington's Council of War, meeting in strict secrecy at his Cambridge headquarters, debated the risks and potential rewards of seizing Dorchester Heights. The operation would require moving men and artillery under cover of darkness, constructing fortifications strong enough to withstand British counterattack, and completing the entire operation before dawn revealed the colonial positions to enemy observers. General John Thomas of Massachusetts, a veteran of the French and Indian War, volunteered to lead the assault on Dorchester Heights. Thomas understood that success would depend on meticulous planning and flawless execution, as any delay or mistake could expose his forces to devastating British fire from both land and sea. The night of March 4, 1776 was chosen for the operation, taking advantage of a new moon that would provide maximum darkness for the colonial movement. Washington ordered diversionary attacks on other British positions to mask the sounds of construction on Dorchester Heights and prevent British attention from focusing on the main effort. As documented in the contemporary records of the Massachusetts Historical Society, the colonial forces moved with a precision that surprised even their own commanders. Over 2,000 men, accompanied by artillery teams and supply wagons, crossed the frozen ground to Dorchester Heights without detection by British sentries. The construction of fortifications proceeded with remarkable speed, aided by prefabricated sections prepared in advance and the frozen ground that held earthworks more securely than would have been possible in warmer weather. By dawn, the British garrison awoke to find substantial fortifications overlooking their positions, armed with artillery capable of making Boston Harbor untenable for British shipping. General Howe's reaction to the appearance of colonial fortifications on Dorchester Heights was swift and decisive. He recognized immediately that the American position made the British occupation of Boston militarily unsustainable, as colonial artillery could now dominate both the city and the harbor. That served as its lifeline. The British general faced a stark choice: launch an immediate assault on the colonial positions before they could be further strengthened, or abandon Boston entirely and seek a more defensible base of operations elsewhere. Howe's experience at Bunker Hill had taught him the cost of frontal assaults against prepared colonial positions, but remaining in Boston under American guns was equally unacceptable. British preparations for an assault on Dorchester Heights proceeded throughout March 5th, with landing craft assembled and assault troops prepared for another costly attack up fortified slopes. However, a violent storm that evening prevented the planned assault and gave Howe additional time to reconsider his options. The storm that saved British lives also provided Washington with the opportunity to further strengthen his positions. Additional troops and artillery were moved to Dorchester Heights under cover of darkness, while engineers worked to improve fortifications that were already formidable obstacles to assault. By March 7th, Howe had reached the conclusion that Boston was no longer tenable as a British base. The general began planning an evacuation that would preserve his army for future operations, while acknowledging the reality of American control over the Massachusetts capital. The evacuation negotiations that followed were conducted through intermediaries, with both sides seeking to avoid unnecessary bloodshed while achieving their strategic objectives. Washington, while maintaining pressure on British positions, was willing to allow an orderly evacuation in exchange for the peaceful withdrawal of British forces and their loyalist allies. The successful seizure of Dorchester Heights represented more than a tactical victory for the Continental Army. It demonstrated that American forces could execute complex military operations against professional opposition and achieve strategic objectives through careful planning and superior position rather than simple numerical superiority. The morning of March 17, 1776, dawned with a sight that few colonials had dared to imagine 11 months earlier: British ships in Boston Harbor loading troops and supplies for evacuation. General Howe's decision to abandon Boston marked the first major strategic victory for American forces and validated the sacrifice of thousands of men who had maintained the siege. Through winter's hardships, the evacuation itself was a complex military operation that reflected the professionalism of British forces even in defeat. Over 9,000 soldiers, along with more than 1,000 loyalist civilians who feared retribution from returning patriots, boarded ships for Halifax, Nova Scotia. The sight of British regulars withdrawing under American pressure sent shockwaves through the empire and electrified colonial resistance movements from Georgia to Maine. Washington's forces maintained their positions throughout the evacuation, ready to resume hostilities if British intentions proved deceptive. The Continental Army had learned caution through hard experience, and the commander-in-chief was determined to avoid any action that might snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. The entry of American forces into Boston on March 18th revealed the toll that months of siege had taken on the city. Buildings had been damaged by artillery fire. Fuel shortages had forced residents to burn furniture and fences for warmth, and the harbor was cluttered with obstacles and sunken vessels. Yet the city remained fundamentally intact, a testament to the restraint shown by both sides throughout the siege. Colonial celebrations of their victory were tempered by the sobering reality of what lay ahead. The successful siege of Boston had proven that American forces could challenge British power effectively, but it had also transformed the colonial rebellion into something approaching a full-scale war against the world's most powerful empire. Washington understood that British withdrawal from Boston represented the end of one phase of the conflict, rather than ultimate victory. Intelligence reports indicated that British forces were regrouping for major operations against other colonial centers, particularly New York, which offered better harbor facilities and a more defensible strategic position than Boston. The political implications of the siege's successful conclusion were as significant as its military consequences. The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, found its hands strengthened in debates over independence by the demonstration that American forces could achieve victory against professional European troops. The siege had also created a truly Continental Army from the disparate militia forces that had initially surrounded Boston. Soldiers from different colonies had served together, shared hardships, and developed the mutual respect essential for effective military cooperation. The provincialism that had initially divided American forces had been largely overcome through shared sacrifice and common purpose. British reaction to the loss of Boston was swift and decisive. Lord North's government in London recognized that the colonial rebellion had evolved beyond a mere police action requiring local suppression. The successful siege demonstrated that American resistance possessed both the military capability and political determination necessary to sustain prolonged warfare against British forces. The lessons learned during the Siege of Boston would influence military strategy throughout the remainder of the Revolutionary War. American commanders had discovered that they could compete effectively with British forces when fighting from fortified positions with adequate artillery support, while British officers had learned to respect the fighting qualities of American soldiers. When properly led and motivated. As spring arrived in Massachusetts, both armies prepared for the next phase of what was rapidly becoming a war for American independence. The Siege of Boston had ended, but the larger conflict it had helped to create was just beginning. The successful defense of colonial rights had evolved into something far more ambitious: the creation of a new nation founded on principles of liberty and self-governance. The farmers and merchants who had answered the alarm after Lexington and Concord had accomplished something remarkable. They had forced the British Empire to evacuate one of its most important North American strongholds. In doing so, they had taken the first crucial step toward transforming 13 separate colonies into the United States of America. The Siege of Boston was over, but its legacy would endure as long as people remembered that free men fighting for their homes and principles could challenge and defeat the greatest military power of their age. The revolution that began with shots fired on Lexington Green had found its first great victory in the hills surrounding Boston Harbor.